Hello, and welcome to Season 8, Episode 2 of Bad Gays, a podcast about evil and complicated queers in history. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer and historian currently at work on a biography of the fashion designer Rudy Gernreich.
And my name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
And last week we talked about Olive Yang, who was a CIA-involved, potentially transmasculine, potentially lesbian opium smuggler who was active in the border regions between Burma and China in the 20th century. Who are we talking about this week, Hugh?
I want to talk about a very bad bisexual, a man who would probably have passed into the footnotes of the memoirs of countless other bad bisexuals were it not for the writings of his, frankly, astonishing band of sisters. This episode is about the lawyer, soldier, and society favourite Tom Mitford.
I am looking forward to this, Hugh, because every single anecdote you have told me about the Mitfords as a family, I don't quite believe that such people could ever have existed, and yet if they ever existed anywhere, it would have to be England, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I am going to hold up my hands here and confess that the idea of featuring Tom is partly a ruse to actually talk about his whole family, and especially his 6 siblings, the famed Mitford sisters, whose intense, often conflicting relationships have become something of an obsession really for English culture, and not always, it has to be said, a very healthy obsession. They really embody so much about the English elite. They're eccentric, vicious, often listless, desperately sad at times, and I have to say it's an obsession that I am not personally immune to. Ever since I read Jessica Mitford's memoir, Ons and Rebels, as a teenager, I found them a really fascinating family whose sort of contradictions really illustrate the strange political and social atmosphere of England in the first half of the 20th century, and who seem in many ways to provide a sort of object lesson in British class politics as it began to morph and mutate as the century progressed. So this episode is, my cheat episode where I'm allowed to talk about random British aristocrats. But my pledge to you in return for letting me do this episode is I'm going to hopefully allow my interest in them to illuminate their fascinating stories, but I'm not going to airbrush out their complexities nor remove them from their sort of social and political context, which I think their fascinating lives actually also illuminate in turn.
Because you've always struck me as the kind of, like a sort of royal watcher type who just sort of loves the aristocracy and just loves sort of watching them and looking at them and celebrating them and their stylishness and their wit.
Well, this is part of the thing with the Mitfords is they are portrayed as extremely glamorous. I'm not sure they actually were that glamorous, especially in retrospect.
Well, in England, the bar's low.
Yeah, and so there is a lot of material out there on the Mitfords that is interesting, but that does, to an extent, whitewash a lot of their stories or tries to sort of downplay some of the really terrible aspects of their lives. I also promise you, as has become a theme of this podcast, some DENs, some disturbingly English names.
Oh, good.
So, the family. We'll start with mum and dad. The Mitfords were from a sort of impeccable aristocratic stock. They had what was referred to in the sort of crypto-eugenicist language of the time, good breeding. And class became one way or another an obsession for the whole family. So Tom's mother was called Sydney Bowles. She was the daughter of an MP, and he was also the founder of these society magazines Vanity Fair and The Lady.
Oh, it's in Vanity Fair.
As in Vanity Fair,
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
And Tom's father was David Mitford, the second Baron Redesdale. So the Mitfords are an aristocratic family dating back for the medieval era, and they sort of pop up in English history in the usual places.
My toxic trait is that I love reading Vanity Fair. I constantly find myself running up against their online article limit.
Well, I hope I won't ruin it for you. David Mitford was a strange man. He never joined a political party, despite sitting in the House of Lords, because he was a baron. But one of his daughters, Jessica Mitford, described him as, quote, one of nature's fascists.
And that was his daughter, who was supposed to like him.
There wasn't a huge... There was love within the family, but it was very strange, and there was a lot of animosity as well.
Not in a fancy English family, no.
Yeah, right. But he was a lifelong reactionary and a very fervent nationalist. And he had a temperamental politics because he also had, in his personal life, he was sort of renowned for being angry and capricious and mean and belligerent. He's very much in the mould of those other aristocratic British dads we've discussed before, like Lord Alfred Douglas's dad, the Marquis of Queensberry, or Francis Bacon's dad, in fact. And he had actually quite good reason to be grouchy. He was a veteran of both the Boer War and the First World War, and he'd been shot 3 times in battle. and had lost a lung in the process.
Oh, wow.
And he was also, despite his aristocratic status, financially quite insecure. He was struggling to maintain his very poorly developed estates, and he dabbled in lots of different schemes, including surveying a gold mine in Canada that had no gold in it, and things like this. And the family also moved a number of times before they finally bought land in Swinbrook in the Cotswolds, where David built a home, described by Jessica as having, quote, the utilitarian look of frankly institutional architecture. It could be a small barracks, a girls' boarding school, a private lunatic asylum, or, in America, a country club.
I mean, wasn't it a sort of private lunatic asylum?
Yes, very much so. Baron and Baroness Redesdale were known by their children as Farv and Muv. Be warned, Ben, this episode will include lots of strange invented words because their children, who were raised largely without any formal education at all in rural England, developed a very strong internal family culture, including secret languages and lots of nicknames. And in fact, to complicate it, they all had different nicknames for each other, and sometimes those nicknames were often used by various members of the family to refer to different people. So when you're reading their letters, the same nickname is used by different people to refer to different people.
Oh, God. Shaking the English aristocracy as a whole and slamming it into a wall and screaming, why can't you just be normal for 10 minutes?
So they got married in 1904, and over the next 16 years, they had 7 children. I'm going to list
they were busy.
I'm going to list the children, Ben, and I'm wondering if you can guess by their names alone which one of them turned out to be the Hitler worshipper. We have, in descending order, Nancy, Pamela, Tom, Diana, Unity Valkyrie, Jessica, and Deborah.
Which one of the following people is a Nazi? Susan, Elaine, Brunhilde, or Jonathan? I'm going to go with Unity Valkyrie, but I suspect I may be wrong.
No, you're entirely right. Unity Valkyrie was the Hitler worshipper.
Unity Valkyrie. Were they Wagnerians? Why did they name her Valkyrie?
Yeah, I think though he was a fan, although he wasn't very educated. One of the reasons we actually know so much about the family is that the girls were absolutely compulsive letter writers to each other their entire life. You know, their collected letters covers about 70 years. And 4 of the daughters also became writers of varying skill and political allegiances, which is quite an achievement considering none of the daughters had been formally educated at all because Favre didn't believe in it. Instead, they had Muv and a string of governesses who prepared them basically for marriage and motherhood. And their father wasn't deeply intellectual. He claimed to have read only one book in his entire life, which was Jack London's White Fang. And he said that he loved it so much he decided to never read another book again, lest it spoil the experience of reading for him.
Oh, God.
And like, imagine the psyche to be like, wow, I enjoy this. I'm never going to do it again, just in case I ruin it. But as the episode is about him, we'll start with Tom, who was the 3rd child. And he was the only one who did have a formal education, for all the good it did him. He was born in 1909. And as the only son of the family and the heir to the seat, he was the subject of adoration for his parents, but his sisters, not so much. And of course, as the only boy in a family of 6 girls, he was always going to be different. And this was really exacerbated when he was sent to boarding school at age 8. He was very different to his sisters and away from them. So the girls stuck at home were always inventing secret languages, one of which was called Boodledidge, from which he was obviously excluded from learning. And
Boodledidge like Pete Buttigieg?
Boodledidge.
Boodledidge.
Yeah. I think Unity and also Debo were both known as Bood at various times from various people.
Wait, who's Debo?
Debo is Deborah, the last one.
Deborah is Debo, okay.
Right.
Sorry, we're already getting into...
So they all have... That's the other confusing thing is they all have nicknames that then set. So Deborah became known as Debo. Jessica became known as Decca.
Sometimes Booge.
Yeah, exactly. This is why it's complicated. And they also established sort of secret societies, such as one which was called the Ons, spelt H-O-N-S, as in honourables, because they were honourable. So according to Jessica, quote, the main activity of the Ons was to plan the outwitting and defeat of the horrible counter-Ons, of which Tom was the chief representative. Death to these horrible counter-Ons was our slogan as we chased them all over the house with homemade spears, end quote. She also recalled how, even late in life, her mother still owned a cardboard badge on which was written, League Against Tom. Head, Nancy. Nancy being the oldest.
God.
So poor kid. The girl's nickname for him was Tudemy. Yet by most accounts, this was the sort of light-hearted ribbing of Tom that he endured, and there is a sense as well that he became the man of the house who could endure such teasing, unlike his father David, who was irrational, and his unpredictable rages, which were often described by Jessica as a sort that shake and silence the whole house. Actually, Ons and Rebels is a really interesting, remarkable memoir. It's a very fun read, but you do see parts of it today that are described as light-hearted, which today you'd read very differently. Like growing up in a house with someone with unpredictable and explosive anger is kind of a fuck-up.
Right.
Still, this relentless teasing of Tom, the girl's natural enemy, prepared him very well for English public school, where he seemed to thrive, actually. It gave him...
Well, as we all know, English public school has led to many generations of extremely politically, socially, and sexually normal people. Some of the most normal people to ever exist, actually, have come out of English public school, wouldn't you say, Hugh?
Right. It also gave him actually plenty of opportunities to sort of return fire on his sisters. Like he would taunt them by telling them at school he was allowed to eat sausages for breakfast every day, while at home only Favre was permitted to eat sausages at all. And Tom really didn't take after Favre at all. He was a lover of literature, and when Favre decided the new home that he'd built needed a library to supplement the books that had been left to him by Tom's grandfather, he actually entrusted the task to Tom to do, because he regarded him as already better qualified for it.
He wasn't just going to stock the family library with 5,000 copies of White Fang.
At school he was friendly and charming, and he soon made friends with plenty of his dorm mates, including a boy named James Lees Milne, who would go on to play an important part in the life of his family. So after finishing prep school, Tom went to Eton College, which is England's, I guess, most prestigious public school. There is an apocryphal story that the Duke of Wellington, having beaten Napoleon, had claimed, quote, that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, which he didn't actually say. But the line does hold a popular truth that Britain's officer class emerged from a public school system designed specifically to train a military and colonial elite. In the words of George Orwell, who also went to Eton, the, quote, middle classes are trained for war, not technically, but morally. And so in World War One, the public school elite was actually disproportionately hit by casualties. You know, there's some people say this sort of disproves the idea that the British Army in World War One were lions led by donkeys. You know, that is that there was this feckless upper class elite that sort of wasted the lives of millions of working class people, which is true. I don't think it does prove that wrong, but it does suggest that they're just as likely to kill their own children as working class children. Public school alumni were actually twice as likely to die in the First World War as the average soldier. And
that's also part of the reason maybe why World War One has such a particular haunting in the national memory, because it's also the type of people who died, right? And not just the number. It's like everyone knew someone who died, but more importantly, everyone important knew someone who died.
And the people who came back were also, like the people who were serving who came back were and got into positions of power and authority. Yeah. And they were important, and especially at Eton, over 1,000 students and teachers and alumni died in the war. About 1 in 5 of everyone who joined up in Eton, 20% died in the war.
Well, good news is that by Vietnam, the Anglo-American Empire had gotten much better about protecting middle and upper class children from deaths in these kinds of adventures.
So, I think it must have been very tough for the sort of young men who were attending school in those years following the war, with this sense of guilt of having been too young to fight, and then dealing with traumatised, brutalised tutors returning from the front lines, and the deep sense of loss that probably pervaded their education, which in many ways had nothing to do with them. They were tiny children when a war was happening. But despite this ever-present catastrophe, his school days appear to have been generally happy. He excelled at music, which was his real passion, playing the organ, make your own jokes here, the flute, your own jokes, and the piano. And he was
I thought you were going to say the clarinet.
the pink oboe.
Then we could complete the trio of dick jokes.
Yeah, and he was allowed a piano in his room, which was a rare privilege. And like his sisters, he was bright, good-looking and popular, and sometimes very popular. As they became teenagers, his friendship with James Lees Milne, who he went to prep school with, bloomed into a romance. James would later recall, quote, on Sunday eves before chapel at 5, when the toll of the bell betokened that all boys must be in their pews, he and I would, standing on the last landing of the entrance steps, out of sight of the masters in the antechapel and all the boys inside, passionately embrace, lips to lips, body pressed to body, each feeling the opposite fibre of the other. End quote.
That sounds more fun to me than church.
Yeah, it's giving Heartstopper a bit. We have talked a bit in the past about homosexuality in English public schools, as you mentioned, and how it functions. There was this sort of institutionalisation of this form of sexual activity, which was often in a sort of extremely abusive and damaging way. And there was also, of course, a tolerance of childhood sexual abuse disguised as some sort of remnant of a classical model of education. But I don't think that is what's happening here at all. Lees-Milne's description of his relationship with Tom is not just mutual, but very romantic.
Right, and it's also, they were approximately the same age, right? Like, it wasn't like a younger boy
exactly the same
forced
age,
into a subservient relationship to a number of older boys, something, you know.
Yeah, and they knew each other well. They'd been friends since their earlier school days, and it sort of just grew into something more. And they would go on to remain friends, actually, long after the sexual component of their relationship had ended.
Well, that's kind of sweet.
And James was not his only boyfriend at school. He also had a relationship with, name alert, James Alexander Wedderburn Hamish Sinclair Erskine.
Oh, my goodness.
Who will also, like James, recur in the lives of Tom's sisters later on.
Oh, boy.
Much of the literature which discusses this period likes to portray these relationships as like romantic friendships or perhaps schoolboy crushes that dissipated once these men had reached adulthood. I don't think that's quite accurate either, but I don't think it's accurate to say that these men were homosexuals who were then forced into heterosexual marriages later by a repressive society. Many of these men, I'm sure, were bisexual, and I think Tom was probably one of them. But I'm not sure it's a bisexuality we'd necessarily recognise today. Rather, I think there was a permissiveness for certain types of relationships at certain points in the lives of men of a certain class position. And this framework for sexual orientations was understood, but it wasn't necessarily talked about. So I think the men like Evelyn Waugh, the English novelist who'd gone to become friends of all the sisters, he complied with this structure. He was quite openly attracted to men as a youngster, had boyfriends before becoming a confirmed Catholic heterosexual later in life. Others, like Hamish Sinclair Erskine, were lifelong homosexuals, and they suffered as a result of not complying with this sex model. James Lee Milne, for example, would go on to marry Alvilda, the Viscountess Chaplin.
Oh, that needs an English name a lot. Come on. Alvilda the Viscountess Chaplin. Yeah. Excuse you, you don't have one of those. That's not a real thing. You made that. Admit that you made that one up.
No, they had this sort of amazing open queer marriage where both of them engaged in same-sex affairs.
With Alvilda the Viscountess of Chaplin, whatever the fuck?
Yeah, I think I'm right in saying that she had an affair with Virginia Woolf, perhaps.
Ooh.
Or someone in that Bloomsbury circle, maybe it's not Virginia Woolf.
I still maintain you made that name up, but fine, I'll go with it for now, because I trust you.
So which of these models was Tom? It's quite hard to know, but we do know that his homosexual relationships continued past his school days. There was an overlap with his heterosexual relationships later on in his life, and also that his schoolboy relationships were far from just sort of romantic friendships, as they would have been called. And his sisters at the time even understood that there was a sexual component. Mary S. Lovell recounts in her biography of the sisters that on one occasion he asked his mother if a quote-unquote friend from Eton could come stay. And Mother replied that that was fine, of course, but the house was full of guests that weekend, so would he mind terribly if him and his friend shared a bedroom? And all his sisters reportedly doubled over laughing at this, and his mother was very confused at what they thought was so funny.
I can't imagine what they thought was so funny, can you?
And he had no problem with his friend sharing his bed.
Oh, of course not.
So on leaving school, Tom joined his elder sisters in that very strange generation of post-war youngsters who entered into British society, who sort of came of age after the war. And they were subject to this strange double bind because they were often resented by those who had fought or the families of those who had died, but at the same time, they lacked this enormous social opportunity the war provided to prove oneself. They were really looked down on in a lot of ways by the elder generations. And then they were also quite influenced by those who'd come back from the war, often not much older than them, still very young adults themselves. You know, it was actually possible to enlist, fight the entire 4 years of the war, return, and still be under the age of majority, which was 21. So in the 1920s, there emerged this new generation, especially within the ruling elite, who rejected much of this sort of social conformity and the unmanageable expectations of this older generation and embraced a rapidly changing society brought on by a shocking new modernity. So that young elite, dedicated to aestheticism and partying and having fun, was known in the UK as the Bright Young Things. or the bright young people sometimes.
Yes.
This is what the sisters and Tom were.
The most devastating comment on anything I have ever written came from an English teacher who wrote on a short story that I wrote in the 11th grade, "Isn't this a little bit bright young thing?" B, Y, and T were all capitalized. I remember it to this day.
So let's introduce his sisters as individuals, and they were all very individual. We'll start with the eldest and we'll work our way down. So first of all, we have Nancy, who was born in 1904. I'm going to put my cards on the table again and say I quite like Nancy. As the eldest, she came out, quote unquote, as a debutante, that's how they put it at the time, into society aged 18 in 1922. Do you know what coming out is?
It's when you're presented as an eligible bride to be, right? As entered into society. You have a coming out ball and you wear a fancy dress and you're presented as an adult.
Yeah, you're sort of entering onto the formal marriage market. But
yeah.
it's really for a social season of balls and tea dances and dinners and so forth.
To which you are now invited and don't stay home.
Exactly. The aim was really to snatch you a husband who was preferably rich or noble.
Right.
Or both.
So the 18 to 25-year-old guys are at these balls looking at the fresh meat showing up from different proper families to see who they can find who will be a proper wife.
Yeah, and they're looking for a beautiful wife, or if they're poor but noble, they're looking for a wife with a good dowry to bring into the family. The girls who were taken to these balls were called Debs, and Debs would...
So at some point we had Deborah known as Debo the Deb.
Exactly.
Deborah Debo.
Debs, to get into this sort of system, you'd have to be sponsored by a woman who had previously been a Deb before, and then you'd be then formally presented to the king at court, and you would then join this season of parties. And this was like the centerpiece of their life, and Nancy was the first one to do it. And she loved it. She really took to the whole London season. She sort of paved the way for her other sisters, and they all looked up to her and they ached to take on this rite of passage.
Right. You go down to London, you get the fancy dress made, you get your picture with the king, you get to do the things.
Yeah, you're no longer this like
danced
little...
all night. I could have danced all night, etc., etc., etc.
You're no longer this like little frumpy schoolgirl with her hair in plaits sort of thing. You've now becoming a woman, and they were all very excited about this. And Nancy loved it. She was charming and she was very intelligent, and so she became very popular on this social scene. She made friends with loads of people, including Evelyn Waugh, who I mentioned earlier. And Evelyn Waugh then introduced her to his literary set at Oxford, which appalled her father. He was sort of disgusted by these sort of effeminate, creative male friends that she had around, which Tom wasn't.
He should have been thrilled. Those are the people who aren't going to knock her up. Like, they have nothing. Yeah. They want nothing to do with it. They have only the best intentions with your daughter.
Well,
if you're an angry conservative man, you should want your daughter to only have lots of gay male friends. She's not going to sleep with any of them.
Well, that's not true, as we'll come on to later.
Oh, well, never mind.
So, she became engaged to Tom's ex-boyfriend, Hamish, which everyone thought was a terrible idea. Even Evelyn Waugh regarded it as totally fruitless because Hamish was a lifelong gay.
Sounds potentially more fruitful than fruitless, but maybe not in the way that she was anticipating.
You can watch out for this. This becomes a habit of Mitford sisters falling for Tom's ex-boyfriends.
It's like, what are they, the Liza Minnelli of England, who's marrying gay guys? What, like...
Yeah.
Right.
So she then became a gossip columnist. This is the same, actually, generation as Tom Dryburgh, who we did an episode on previously, who was also a gossip columnist, as was Evelyn Waugh. We didn't really need to get around to it and do an Evelyn Waugh episode.
We really do, don't we?
Season, in fact. And then she became a novelist, who kind of like Waugh as well in his sort of earlier work, and some of his later work. She wrote about and described very well exactly this social scene of the bright young things that they were a part of. And I actually have to admit that I love Nancy Mitford's novels. They're light, they're often portrayed as light, but they're not frivolous. They are very interesting. And many of them, like In Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate, are actually just extremely thinly veiled romaniclef, that's the word?
Right.
Like, they're just her life with the names changed, basically, that sort of describe her own feelings towards her family and then later her lovers, including her husband, Peter Todd, a sort of slightly sad figure who wasted his talents. He was an aid worker during the Spanish Civil War.
But wait a minute, wasn't she engaged to Tom's ex-boyfriend Hamish?
Yeah, they didn't get married.
They didn't get married, and then she married Peter Todd.
Yes.
Okay.
And then she had a long-term lover called Gaston Polewski, who was a very charismatic womanizing commander of the Free French forces.
With that name, no. What? She could have found something more obvious. She could have had an affair with a guy named Frenchie McAffair. Like...
Yeah, he was very much like that. And he's a character in her books who's very entertaining, and you can see the attraction the way she writes about him. He later went on to become a sort of leading Gaullist politician post-war. Okay, done. Nancy. Next. The most enigmatic of the sisters, I think, was Pamela. She's often referred to just as the chicken farmer.
God, it's awful.
Or sometimes by her sisters, they knew her by the not entirely complimentary nickname of simply Woman.
You're right, that is worse than chicken farmer.
Woman, apparently, because she had the most feminine charms, but it's still a strange nickname. And she very much lived the quietest life of all the sisters. She was very attracted to country pursuits and chicken farming, of course. But she was not without her charms herself. She had many admirers, including the bisexual poet laureate and perennial crush haver, John Betjeman. He also proposed to her twice and was turned down twice. So this is their thing, is relationships with bisexual men. And she was regarded as very beautiful. And at 29, she went on to marry the physicist and amateur steeplechaser, like a jockey, Derek Jackson, who had once run in the Grand National, which was a fitting husband, really, for someone who said that when she was a girl, she wanted to grow up and become a horse.
Oh, God. This is getting worse and worse and worse.
So English. So you'll never guess what Derek Jackson was.
Bisexual?
A bisexual. And a womanizer at the same time. Their marriage lasted about 15 years before they finally divorced. Derek to spend more time with his new wives. I think he had 4 of them in total.
Is this a good time to make a barebacking joke?
It's always a good time to make a barebacking joke. And Pamela spent more time with her horses and chickens and dogs. But her story wasn't a sad one at all. Pamela and Derek actually remained great friends, and when he died, she inherited all his fortune, which must have pissed off any of the 4 following wives, I'm sure, including the wife he was still married to.
Wait, he was still married to someone and she got the money?
Yeah.
Oh my God. I would be pissed. I'd be fucking furious. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And she was probably much younger, too.
I'm sure, yeah.
Oh.
She then lived out the rest of her days breeding her chickens, and she even appeared on TV to discuss the subject, which led her little sister Debo, to remark, quote, "Woman ought to have her own chicken chat show."
Oh my God.
And
I would watch that.
Yeah.
I would watch a talk show with chickens.
Well, you can see it. I think it's on YouTube.
No, I want a talk show where a British royal woman interviews chickens, and she says, "So how's your day been?" and sticks the mic in the chicken's face, and the chicken's like...
But
Tell me you wouldn't watch that show, Hugh.
I would watch that show.
Yeah.
She wasn't lonely either. After Derek, she met another horse rider, this time an Italian woman named Guidita Tomasi, who became her quote-unquote companion. The nature of this is disputed by various different sisters, but according to her sister Jessica, she was a you-know-what-bean.
I love to have a live-in Italian companion.
Yeah. And be a you-know-what-bean.
Well, you know.
So Tom was the next...
May we all end up with dashing live-in Italian companions.
Tom was the next child, so we'll skip him and move on to his 2 sisters, whose political endeavours would play a very large part in his life and ultimately in his death. So the next sister, born in 1910, a year after Tom, is the contemptible Diana Mitford, who would go on to be probably the most famous or infamous of the sisters. So her adult life started very much like her sister's. She was introduced to society at 18, became a deb. She very rapidly met and fell in love with and then secretly got engaged to Brian Guinness, who was heir to the enormous Guinness brewing empire.
I was just going to make the Guinness beer joke, and then it turns out it was real.
It was real, yeah. He was absurdly rich, really massively rich. And so together the 2 of them in their London home became this sort of gravitational pole of attraction for the bright young things. If you want a good taste of the world in which they lived, you should read Evelyn Waugh's satire on the in crowds, his last satire before he sort of turned away from debauchery towards Catholicism. It's called Vile Bodies, and it's actually dedicated to the Guinnesses.
Diana Mitford and...
To Diana and Brian, yeah.
Yeah.
So amongst their japes and hijinks was an art hoax. Everyone loves an art hoax. That they perpetrated with their friend Brian Howard. He was a model for Anthony Blanche in Waugh's later Catholic novel Brideshead Revisited. I'm obsessed with it. And so they perpetrated this hoax on the London art scene against sort of newspaper columnists, these gossip columnists and art lovers who, I presume there's some sort of thing about them being pretentious, maybe it was just for fun. But they knocked up a whole bunch of paintings and pastiches of modernist works that were very popular in Paris at the time. And then they held an exhibition of them in the Guinness family home, claiming that they were works of this newly discovered outsider artist genius who they'd met in the English countryside, a German exiled painter named Bruno Hatt. And at the launch of this exhibition, the sort of role of Hatt was played by Tom Mitford himself in this disguises and coats and stuff, speaking in a slow German accent. And this was exactly the sort of frivolous bullshit that the Bright Young Things is all based around that people love.
Right, and all you've proven is that you can convince people who are just as shallow as you that things that look like you all think the things look like those things.
Right, exactly. And you'll be very pleased to know, Ben, that our old bad gay friend, the communist, gossip columnist, and evangelical cocksucker, Tom Dryburgh, didn't fall for it.
Oh, good.
Anyway, Diana's marriage to Brian Guinness didn't last very long at all, because just a couple of years after they got married, she met a young political firebrand at a garden party in London, and she fell in love with him. His name was Sir Oswald Mosley.
Oh, no.
Yeah. He was a baronet. He'd entered Parliament aged just 21, just a few weeks after the end of the First World War. And he started his political career as a Conservative, but then he sort of came to exemplify this dissatisfaction that this new modern generation had with the old Victorian order that had led to the war in the first place, that they wanted to continue. And he became an early advocate of the economic ideas advanced by John Maynard Keynes, who we discussed in a special episode a few years ago with Richard Power Said, another bisexual, bad bisexual. And in 1922, he then gave up the Tory whip and became an independent. And then just 2 years after that, he became a member of the Labour Party. So despite his wealth and his status, he actually joined the Independent Labour Party, which was a sort of affiliate socialist party even further to the left of Labour at the time. So mostly regarded that neither of these parties had sufficiently radical solutions to the economic crisis that was engulfing the world in the late 1920s. He had presented a Keynesian proposal to Labour conference about how to deal with unemployment and, in his words, quote, obliterate class conflict. But the proposal, which was called the Mosley Memorandum, which had been signed by 15 other Labour MPs, was rejected by conference. And so in 1931, he formed a new party with 6 other breakaway Labour MPs, which he called the New Party, very creatively. And it was around this time that he met Diana. She knew that she loved him, but she couldn't be with him as he was already married. So she divorced Brian Guinness and she moved out to a flat closer to Mosley. I don't know if they were having an affair at this time, but she was certainly making her intentions clear.
So wait, she divorced her husband without him divorcing his wife?
Yes.
Oh, she was stupid.
Well, as luck would have it, in 1933, Mosley's wife, Cynthia, died. And shortly afterwards...
How convenient of her.
Yeah, and of natural causes. And shortly after, Mosley and Diana became lovers, and then in 1936, they married. So by this time, Mosley's drift towards authoritarianism had broken his new party, and following some trips to see Mussolini's fascist government in Italy, he founded his next party, party number 4, the British Union of Fascists. And Diana was an enthusiastic, lifelong fascist, as was her husband. In a review of her biography in the London Review of Books in 1999, Christopher Hitchens wrote, quote, "We're confronted here with the worst and not the least bright of the bright young things, with a vile mind and a gorgeous carapace, and with a maddening class confidence allied to a tiny repetitive tick of fanaticism," end quote. That fanaticism really was a deep-rooted anti-Semitism. I think it's a good moment to point out, as we did in our episode on the fascist politician Rother Linton Orman last season, that these movements are emerging not out of popular working class discontent, as is sometimes claimed, but straight out of the elite. You know, Mosley was a baronet, despite having these Keynesian economic philosophy, and like Diana Mosley, he emerged from this culture of British imperialism and conservatism, and the power of their movement was driven, as Hitchens remarks, by this maddening class confidence. We can come back to Diana's fascist life in a moment, but while we're here in the 1930s, perhaps it's time to introduce Sister number 4, Unity Valkyrie Mitford.
So wait, Diana wasn't the most fascist?
I think you could make a good argument Diana was the most fascist, because hers was definitely a very clear political conviction.
So let's get to Unity Valkyrie.
So as her name suggests, she was born to be a fascist, and again, Her very name, Unity Valkyrie, puts paid to this lie that fascist extremism is like alien to the conservative British aristocracy. She was conceived in Canada, in a mining town where her father was working. Do you want to hazard a guess, Ben, at what the name of the town was that she was conceived in?
Unity?
Swastika, Ontario.
Well, I'm sorry. Unity Valkyrie Mitford was conceived in Swastika, Ontario? Yeah. Please tell me the town has been renamed.
No, it's still called Swastika, Ontario. I mean, it was named well before the emergence of the swastika.
Yeah, no, I'm sure, Hindu temples in the West usually avoid putting swastikas all over them because at this point...
It has a different meaning.
It means something else now.
So she was born in 1914, which meant she was a debutante in 1932. She emerged into this social scene, one part of which was extremely enamoured with this handsome fascist leader Mosley, with his black shirt union. He led a sort of militia. And his hostess wife, and Unity was no different. She was introduced to Mosley at a garden party hosted by her sister when she was 18, and she became almost instantaneously a devoted, fanatical fascist. In 1933, she accompanied Diana to the Nuremberg rally in Germany, the Nazi rally, and this began her obsession, which later became a mutual obsession, with Adolf Hitler.
Oh, boy.
The following year, Diana and Unity moved to Germany for a while to learn German, and Unity started taking to this osteria in Munich, where Hitler would eat his dinner every day. And eventually Hitler noticed her and her sort of stalking behaviour, and then they ended up striking up this very intense friendship, the true nature of which has never really been determined. Some people suggest it was romantic. I think that's probably quite credible. And other people suggest it was sexual, which is also, I think, eminently possible from what we can tell. Unity very clearly worshipped Hitler. She described him as, quote, "So kind and so divine, I suddenly thought I would not only like to kill all who say and do things against him, but also torture them. It's wonderful to think that someone like him can ever have been thought of." End quote. That's the fascist mind in a nutshell. He's so wonderful, I will torture anyone who disapproves. Hitler's admiration for Unity was also superlative. He described her as, quote, "a perfect specimen of Aryan womanhood." Yeah. She was also extremely clear about her anti-Semitism. She described herself as a Jew hater in a letter she wrote to Der Stürmer.
That's about as clear on anti-Semitism as you could get.
Right.
That's like certified anti-Semite. I called myself a Jew hater in a letter to Der Stürmer.
The letter is obviously appalling and shocking, but the way it's written is fucking classic Mitford, which is like, it's a little bit silly, jokey. The bit where she calls herself a Jew hater is a P.S. P.S. I would like it to be known by all your readers that I am a Jew hater. That's the context. And after the war...
rendered me genuinely speechless.
Yeah. After the war, the Mosleys, Diana and Oswald, would very much try to play down their anti-Semitism, claiming, we weren't against Jews, but we were against Jewish international finance, we were against Jewish interests, dragging Britain into the war, blah, blah, blah. The usual dumb disavowal, which is itself fucking anti-Semitism. But this is like a totally unbelievable disavowal. If you read his speeches, like in one of his speeches before the war, he proclaimed that, quote, "stronger even than the stink of oil is the stink of the Jew," end quote. And even after the war, they were very early proponents of Holocaust denialism and revisionism, which is, of course, par for the course for unrepentant fascists. But I think you also have to look at that class confidence in operation here again, because incredibly, the war didn't end their careers, either of them. Mosley re-emerged with another neo-fascist party, the Union Movement, post-war, and their status as glamorous socialites meant that there was no real consequences sort of commensurate with the advocacy of fucking Nazism. They lived in a sort of self-imposed exile in a small palace in France. They were very close friends with their near neighbours, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor.
I was just about to ask if they were around those
also
uniquely unpleasant people.
Fascist apologists.
Well, I have to once again repeat the great line about Wallis Simpson, that she proved every day that it is distinctly possible to be both too rich and too thin.
But what's more, they continue to appear on TV to espouse this ideology. You can watch on YouTube an interview of Mosley in 1967 with David Frost, like the big BBC politics correspondent interviewer, and he's given pretty much free rein to justify his pre-war politics and talk about his economic policies before he's interrupted from the audience by his old foe, which is, and always was, working class communists and Jews in the audience who held him to account. They started heckling him and stopped him sort of spouting this bullshit, as they had done, of course, in the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, or when the community sort of came together to prevent the black shirts from marching through the East End to a rally. Mm-hmm. It's disgusting, and it's extremely part of the British class system. I'm generally of the opinion that the last public appearance of fascist leaders should be upside down at the petrol station. But Diana Mosley was even invited onto the very prestigious BBC radio programme Desert Island Discs in 1989.
What?
Yeah. And
they let her go out to talk about what her favorite songs are?
Yeah, Wagner, of course.
Okay, is this where I have to come out as someone who's actually been to the Bayreuth Festival?
Well, not just you, because, of course, the Mitfords, Diana and Unity went to Bayreuth with Hitler as guest.
Okay, so I'm staring now at my bookshelf where we record, and I promise all of our listeners that if you look at the wonderful book, Wagnerism, by the wonderful Alex Ross, you can find there are many Wagnerisms, and not all of them are totally fascist.
But you could listen to this. The program is still online as part of their archive. It now has a sort of content warning on the website.
Content warning, we accidentally invited this unrepentant Holocaust denial on to talk about her favorite songs.
Not just unrepentant Holocaust denial, but on the Desert Island Discs, she continues to perpetrate the denialism, saying that, Hitler was forced into this by the hands of international Jews who were boycotting his country, blah, blah, blah. She continues to defend her sort of anti-Semitic, pro-Hitler, pre-war opinions. Enough of her. We're still missing two of her sisters.
Oh God, there were so many of them, weren't there?
Yeah. This one now, we can at last find one who can give us some hope. After Unity came Jessica, who I'll refer to as Decca, because she was much better known as Decca. So Decca, even as a teenager, rejected this fascist strain that ran through her family, and she became a committed communist. In fact, when she was a teenager, she shared a bedroom with Unity, and the two sisters had partitioned the bedroom with a thick chalk line that ran down the room, with her bed, with Decca's bed on one side of a portrait of Lenin above it, and Unity's on the other side of a portrait of Hitler.
Oh my God.
You won't be surprised to find out that Decca wanted to get out of the family home as quickly as possible.
Yeah, something tells me that she wasn't so into the idea of being greeted by the king and going out on the debutante circuit.
No. So her way out was through her second cousin, Esmond Romilly, who she'd met when she was 19. He was actually a year younger than her, but he was very much what the English would call a stand-up kind of chap, or I would anyway. So he'd run away from boarding school. He went to Wellington. He'd run away, where he then proceeded to make a series of Marxist student journals that campaigned for the abolition of private education, amongst other things, and for student rights. And then when he was 18, he caught a ferry to Dieppe in France, bought a bicycle, cycled to Marseille, got on a boat to Spain, and fought with the international brigades against Franco's rebellion.
Good for him.
So this, thought Decca, was just the sort of spirit that she needed in her life. And she'd actually spent her entire childhood, she talks about this in Ons and Rebels, she spent her entire childhood saving up money in a running away fund. So she had the equivalent of about £5,000 in today's money to get out of there.
Oh, wow.
And so she recounts in Ons and Rebels how she meets Esmond while he's recuperating from dysentery back in England. They're actually both related to Winston Churchill, which is how they knew each other.
Everyone's related to I assume in general, whenever we're talking about international, actually, all these people are cousins.
So they fall in love. She persuades him that they should elope together. So they elope to Spain to rejoin the international brigades. She only gets a few shots off from the rifle at fascists in the end, because her family used their considerable connections, probably to Churchill, to get a Royal Naval destroyer with her eldest sister Nancy on board to sail down to Bayonne to pick her up.
Oh my God.
And they persuade her to come back. But they can't dissuade her from marrying. So they get married. They live in Rotherhithe, which was then a very poor area of East London. They do sort of social work and they become writers. Very tragically, they lose their daughter. They have a daughter and they lose her when she's, I think, a year old in a measles epidemic in 1938. Oh, she's barely 20 at the time. And then eventually they get across to the US and they have another daughter, Constancia, who later goes on to marry the American civil rights leader and Black Panther, James Foreman. So, last of all, we have the sixth and final daughter, Deborah, also known as Debo to Deb. So Debo probably was the one who followed the aspirations of her parents most closely. After coming out, she met and married the second son of the Duke of Devonshire. However, when his older brother, who was actually married to Kathleen Kennedy, JFK's sister, when he's killed in action in the Second World War.
The Kennedys really were devoted to the idea that a U.S. American family with many fewer generations of inbreeding could nevertheless demonstrate precisely the same sociosexual dysfunctions as generations-old British aristocratic families.
Well, in the end, the reason they ended the society sort of system and the debutante system was because Americans were paying their way to get into it, and it was seen as degrading the entire thing. Quite right, too. So when his older brother is then killed in the war, and then his father dies, they become the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. And she, in some ways, leads that expected life. In the aftermath of the war, the world in which they'd lived pre-war, this world of great country houses and dead balls, etc., it was no longer really economically viable at all. Especially as the price of labour went up. And so Debo is actually now best known in the UK for how she sort of helped turn around this huge family estate of Chatsworth House into a very viable commercial enterprise. It's like a tourist attraction, but it's also an agriculture business, quarrying, a farm shop, restaurant, all this sort of stuff. And she continued to write to all her sisters, and she was the last to die in 2014.
Amazing to think that someone died in 2014 whose sister potentially dated Hitler.
Right. Well, let's get back to the 1930s. So where was Tom in all this?
Yeah, we lost the subject. Hold
Yes.
on. Where's Tom?
So Tom moved to Berlin in the late 1920s to train as a lawyer.
Oh, I'm sure he did a lot of studying.
Right. And
I moved to Berlin to train as a historian, and now look at me. I'm a historian.
Diana, his sister, later said that he wasn't really a Nazi at this point. Evidence suggests that he probably was.
That's the description. He wasn't really a Nazi at this point raises a lot of questions that are already answered by the description.
Yeah. I suspect that he was probably an early adopter of fascist ideology, or at least showed an interest in it. He was also engaged in affairs with both men and women, including the Austrian dancer Tilly Losch, and it's thought also the travel writer Robert Byron. Of course, his sisters had to get involved. Nancy was hoping that Byron would propose to her, only to find out that he was yet another gay. And she'd had quite enough of it. She wrote, quote, "This wretched pederasty falsifies all feelings, and yet one is supposed to revere it." So Robert, Tom and Unity all attended the 1938 Nuremberg Nazi rally together as well. Robert in his role as a sort of anti-Nazi writer, writing critically about it. But there's this photo of Tom and Unity there, their sort of eyes gazing into this Nazi utopia beneath these fluttering swastikas. They look every bit the sort of Aryan poster children they very much wanted to be, defending the frontier against Judeo-Bolshevism and not this weird, isolated offspring of cruel English aristocratic freaks. I don't know. But Unity's attachment to Hitler was getting ever closer. So during the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the German Reich earlier that year, she had even appeared on the balcony in Vienna when he gave his victory speech.
Oh, wow.
She was that close to him. This is why I think the sort of suggestion that they had a romantic relationship is probably true. There were also other lovers, shared lovers, you won't be surprised to know. According to her biographer David Litchfield, Unity was also a lover of Tom's other old squeeze, Janos Almasi, who was this Hungarian count and occultist who liked to practice erotic asphyxiation on Unity with his silk ribbon. She referred to this practice as "my little gaspers."
God. I like how you can take something as awful, but, it has sort of an air of erotic mystery to it, as Hungarian fascist count doing erotic asphyxiation with silk, and in literally 3 words make it so British that it has lost all potential erotic charge.
Right. Yeah, it's like Kath Kids and erotica somehow. It's really weird. My little gaspers. Oof. But I do think that maybe that might have to be taken with a pinch of salt, this biography, because he also alleges that she lost her virginity to Oswald Mosley, which I'm not entirely sure, on a pool table, which I'm not entirely sure is true. It's like...
Yes, and Mrs. White did it in the conservatory.
No, losing your virginity on the pool table kind of makes me think that then they go out to their Chevy afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. I feel it's a little too down home country. Sounds like the lyrics to a Dolly Parton song.
Right. But, at this point we can obviously hear the drumbeat of war approaching as Hitler is annexing more and more territory before finally invading Poland. And so when the UK eventually declares war on Nazi Germany, these family allegiances split it in two, just like their politics. And Diana and her husband Oswald were interned in prison in London as a security risk, which as I
They
mentioned.
should have kept them there.
Frankly, the very least they deserved.
Forever.
And she's very sniffy about it in her conditions in a Desert Island Discs interview I listened to.
How dare they put me in prison simply for the crime of colluding with an enemy of the state, which I did, and it was the right thing to do.
Meanwhile, over in the US, Decker's husband Esmond signs up to fight for the RAF, and he tragically he disappears over Germany on a bombing raid over Hamburg in 1941. So she's left as this young widow in a foreign country, but she was a very tough cookie. She refused to return. She ended up marrying a civil rights lawyer, and she had 2 more children. And then she turned herself to investigative journalism. So as well as writing Ons and Rebels, which you should read, she also published a book called The American Way of Death, which was an expose of the funeral home industry in America in the 1960s. And then Kind and Unusual Punishment, The Prison Business, which is a book about the injustice of the American carceral system. So she's writing about these sort of issues very early in the 1960s.
Good for her.
Now, Ben, at this point, the story gets weird.
Wait, I'm sorry. This has been normal until now?
What do you think as a 60-something, 70-something veteran of the International Brigades, child of this weird family, lost a husband and a child, before the age of 25, runs off to America, becomes an investigative journalist. What do you think she's missing from her life?
What is she missing from her life? I can't possibly imagine.
Well, it's music. So she decides to form her own orchestra, kazoo and cowbell orchestra, which she calls Decca and the Decktones, and then decides...
Did they record for Decca Records?
She did record. She recorded 2 albums, including a cover version, a duet, of the 1962 Bernard Cribbins novelty song, Right Said Fred. Who do you think she decided to partner with as on this duet? This kazoo and cowbell duet by this former international brigadier.
Who?
Maya Angelou.
What the fuck?
Right. Her lifelong friend, Maya Angelou.
Clinton administration alum, Maya Angelou. I thought the weirdest fact that I was going to find out about Maya Angelou this week is that she's in a movie starring Janet Jackson and Tupac, but apparently...
Yeah, now we can listen to her a bit.
Right said Fred, both of us together, one each end and steady as we go. Tried to shift it, couldn't even lift it. We was getting nowhere, and so we had a cup of tea. And right said Fred, give a shot to Charlie, up comes Charlie.
Let me just say, Hugh, I know that Dr. Maya Angelou is a genius. I know that she is a Nobel laureate. I know that she has read at, I believe, multiple presidential inaugurations. I think that any consideration of the life work of Dr. Maya Angelou needs to begin with what we just heard.
With her kazoo and cowbell duet of the Bernard Cribbins hit Right Said Fred.
With the former international brigadier / heiress to a British half-fascist aristocratic family. What the fuck? Man.
Yeah, I just love that song. It's so good. So, Nancy, Diana, Pamela, Debo's later life we've covered, Jessica. So that leaves
Tom?
Unity and Tom. So on the outbreak of the war, Unity couldn't bear to have her loyalties split between her Nazism and her country. Hitler had actually told her well in advance of the invasion of Poland, months in advance, you need to leave now, given her this very privileged information for her own safety, but she refused. She was so committed to Hitler. So upon the outbreak of the war, she took herself fittingly to the English Garden in Munich. She pulled out a pearl-handled revolver that I believe was encrusted in the handle with a swastika, a personal gift from Adolf Hitler, and she shot herself in the head.
Well, she wasn't upside down hanging from a gas station, but she's at least in the right life state, which is to say dead.
No, she didn't die. She survived.
What?
She was hospitalized in Munich. Hitler personally settled up all her bills, paid for hospitalization, visited her in hospital, and then he had her shipped back to England. Now, she was apparently badly brain damaged, according to the official story. She lived with her mother as a carer, was incontinent, at a sort of mental age of about 9. and she died in 1948 from complications because the bullet was still allegedly lodged in her brain. Allegedly because there are some alternative rumours, well researched, surrounding this incident. The first of which I think is probably quite plausible, which is that actually the attempted suicide was a hoax. She was expatriated, as her sister had been, by family influence, with this hoax suicide as a way to sort of prevent her being tried as a traitor, and a scandal had come from it.
Right.
There is another rumour, less plausible, but possible given times and other evidence, that her expatriation was actually because she was, as they say, in the family way, she was pregnant with Hitler's child. That, of course, sounds very sensationalist and far-fetched. There is a documentary that I also watched called Hitler's British Girl by the respected British journalist Martin Bright, which does actually cover this strange relationship, and he does some investigation into it. So there is other stuff going on. For example, it's known that she had a relationship with a British soldier after she came back, which, considering she was supposed to be completely incapacitated, seems unlikely. And
with a mental age of 9?
Yeah.
She was having relationships?
Yeah, and like her mother as a carer.
That seems a little odd, but whatever.
But Tom, well, so despite his pro-Nazi politics, he wasn't interned during the war. Instead, he joined the British Army, the Devonshire Regiment, but he refused to fight against his Aryan brothers, the Nazis. I don't know that you can just pick and choose who you fight against as a soldier, but apparently that was the case. So instead he was sent to fight, first of all in North Africa and Italy, and then later in the war he was sent to the Pacific Theatre. And it was here in Burma that he met his ends at the hands of the sort of racial undermention that he hated so much. He was shot in the head by a Japanese sniper's bullet on the 30th of March 1945. He died just a month before Hitler.
Potentially somewhere near the residence of the subject of our last episode, Olive Yang.
Could well be.
Oh my god, it all comes back to the British Empire, doesn't it?
It does. And that is the life of Tom Mitford. Hi, you're listening to Bad Gays. We're an audience-supported show. We don't have a network, we don't have sponsors or advertising. It's really you guys who keep the show on the road. So if you're interested in supporting us, why not head over to Patreon, where you can listen to Extra Bad Gays, our monthly podcast about all things queer.
It's really fun to do. You get to hear from us every month. You get to hear from us in a less scripted format. We're starting to do fun new things like an advice column segment. Again, all of that is only for subscribers. You can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts right there in the app. We also have new merch for Season 8. We have t-shirts, we have socks that say Evil Twink Energy on them. We have caps in pink and camo and black. Go check it out, all at our website at badgayspod.com. All of that helps us keep the show going and do more of this, which we love to do.
And now, on with the show.
Well, and you weren't lying, you did smuggle in a whole lot of Mitford sisters in there too, but it was worth all of it just to hear Maya Angelou and Jessica Mitford sing Right Said Fred with kazoos and cowbells. And that has so affected my brain, I can barely think of a question to ask you, but let me come up with one. The first and most obvious question I think to ask is about the weird family predilection for all going after the same guys. Was this something that you also saw between the sisters, or was it just that the sisters all wanted the gay guys that their brother had already had?
I think it comes out of the attitude towards sort of like the milieu they're moving in, which is ex-public school boys, overgrown public school boys, who come from a situation where male romance and sexual behaviour is like understood as a norm, I guess.
Right.
And this sort of weird post-war thing of, wanting to live their best life. Everything's been destroyed. We want to live our best life. We want to break free from the old sort of norms. So they continue these sort of sexual relationships a bit longer. There isn't much evidence. I don't think they're all going after the same men between the sisters.
Okay.
Unless you believe the allegation that Unity lost her virginity on a pool table to Oswald Mosley.
My God. I had forgotten about that detail because the Maya Angelou song just blasted everything right out of my head. That makes a lot of sense. How are the Mitfords remembered now? You referred to them as being perhaps overly present in certain contemporary conversations in the UK, but is Tom also remembered? It's funny, until today, I sort of knew in my head that there was a thing called the Mitford sisters, but I had no idea there was a Mitford brother. Is he remembered with them, or are they remembered as fascists, or what are they remembered as?
Well, there's two things, right? They are very entertaining. This is just a sprinkle of things. If you read their letters to each other, it's full of this stuff. They're kind of nutty and very inventive and creative. Their language and their gossips, and they live in this very gossipy world, this social world. Secondly, there's just this huge amount of evidence because they just wrote everything down constantly, 70 years. Their collected letters that you can buy is 800 pages long. And according to the editor, it covers less than 5% of their correspondence. So you're talking about tens of thousands of pages of letters they were writing to each other constantly.
Right, and let me tell you, as a historian, that shit is catnip.
Yeah.
I mean, if you tell me that I have entertaining letters, then I will follow that forever, because it means that you can get page turners out of it, because you always have a quote, you always have a scandal, you always have some gossip.
Right.
You always have a way to sort of leading people through the story.
And anyone who comes along who wants to write a good, best-selling sort of gossipy history, there's always more material. You can always take a different look. I could go away and write an entire book with all this evidence about how they all fell in love with bisexual men.
Right.
You could write an entire book about their fascism or their politics. There's so much evidence, you can write so much about them. So that's one reason they sort of like loom large. And then also because they're so entertaining, they become very present in other retellings of different histories and worlds. Like they're always meeting these people. So if you ever want to write, if you're writing a biography of Winston Churchill or Evelyn Waugh or Keynes or whoever, there's meetings of them in the Mitfords.
Right, in comes the Mitfords, and there they all are, and here's all the stories, and here's all the gossip.
So they become a sort of byword for like covering that period. So, for example, in Peaky Blinders, Diana Mitford appears in Peaky Blinders, and there's some colour there. I don't know if they appear in Downton Abbey, but I'm sure there's some sort of Ramona Clef version of them in there as well. There's a new TV series that's coming out called Outrageous, which is directly based upon them. So I think that's why they're remembered. But my problem really is that there's this constant smudging of the edges around their actual politics that plays up the glamour and suggests kind of inversely from that storytelling, the way we storytell the 1930s by inserting the Mitfords, they kind of become just like characters who only have this politics because they existed in the 1930s, like it's part of the background, where it's not. You can see from hopefully the story I've told that this politics is a part of their family life, and they're committed believers of anti-Semitism. But for some people that doesn't really matter because they just become so charming, and you can read these like funny stories and they appear on TV and they represent this old world that's been lost, etc., etc. But you can't really get away from the fact that like they wanted to kill the Jews.
And if we come to terms with the fact that the Mitfords are responsible for their anti-Semitism, then we also have to come to terms with the responsibility of the elite of non-German European countries for the mass murder of the European Jews, which people would much rather not do, and instead claim that anti-Semitism is somehow being imported again into Europe now, right? Like it's very much a part of this kind of industry of misremembering that mass murder.
Yeah, and the family did not, as individuals and as their family name, did not really suffer from their advocacy of Nazism. And after the war, continued to build careers and continue to write books, and their kids are public figures, etc., etc.
So, Tom Mitford, bad, gay, not, yes, no?
Bad bisexual. Yeah.
I think that's very clear. So if people want to learn more about the Mitfords, where should they turn? What are some of the sources that you used to research this episode?
Read the Mitfords. They wrote so much stuff, memoirs, etc., etc. So the first one I go to for in terms of shortness, entertaining, etc., etc., good politics is Ons and Rebels by Jessica Mitford. In fiction, I love Love in a Cold Climate and A Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford. They're also very entertaining beach reads. Yep. A very interesting sort of analysis, like portrait of that time. I would probably skip A Life in Contrasts, which was Diana's autobiography.
Yeah, some contrasts, all right.
Yeah, unless you have a taste for like explicit Holocaust revisionism, probably don't go there.
You could contrast before 1939, when 6 million European Jews were alive, with after 1945, when they were all murdered. That would be a contrast in her life, don't you think?
Yeah. And then lastly, the one I looked at was The Mitfords, Letters Between Six Sisters, edited by Charlotte Mosley.
Hopefully no relation to Oswald.
Oh, no, the daughter-in-law.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Why is England like this?
No, that's what I mean. They can continue to be public figures. And so I would take that editing with a pinch of salt because obviously it's written by her daughter-in-law. So, and then in terms of something more objective, there is The Mitford Girls by Mary S. Lovell and The Six, The Lives of the Mitford Sisters by Laura Thompson. I both looked at both those books.
Well, that's our show. You can find me at benwritesthings.bluesky.social or at benwritesthings on Instagram or at benwritesthings.com.
And you can find me online at hugh.substack.com.
And until next week, bye now.
Bye.
Bad. 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 Bad.